So you might have noticed a lack of videos on the channel lately, especially a lack of random reviews, and it's because I've been trying to find some time to work on bigger things, and trying new things for a change and get back to some of the old stuff I did, like the return of TJ reviews last week with what is essentially my first straight-up video game review of the SNES Classic. I'm actually particularly proud of that one because I captured all the footage myself on an Elgato for the first time ever because I wanted to accurately represent what the system looked like. It's a long amount of video to edit for what turned out to be like 20 minutes. And I really wanted to give a very thorough and helpful video for anyone looking into it and to help people avoid scalper prices. So, all in all, I'm very happy with how that video came out, and if you checked it out, thank you very much. If you haven't, go take a look. I'm really happy with how it turned out. But it does open me up to a few other subjects, namely one that a lot of people have been hitting on various gaming channels, the possibility of a Nintendo 64 Classic. I loved the N64 as a kid. I can remember going to my friend's house and seeing it for the first time, just like the idea of a video game where I could walk into the distance and see Mario just running around in a 3D environment blew my mind as a kid. Like, this thing immediately went on my must-have list. Loved mine as a kid, and probably the game system that we played the most. Amongst my friends in the neighborhood. So this one means a lot to me. But I was originally going to do this as a, okay, wouldn't it be fun? Okay, let's speculate. What kind of games are going to be on here? But the more I thought about it, the more I genuinely wondered, how viable is this? It's not if an N64 Classic is possible, but how is it going to be able, how will it be produced and still be palatable for, the people who would be interested in this? Now, for the record, before we begin here, I do know that there is a trademark, there is a logo for the N64 controller, much like the logo seen on the N64 or the Super Nintendo and regular Nintendo Classic boxes. So I acknowledge that at the very least Nintendo has it in mind and is planning for it. But that said, the more I thought about it, the more hurdles I found, and it's becoming clear to me that creating an N64 Classic that would actually satisfy the casual gamers and nostalgic gamers is going to be a really tricky endeavor. Now, I have my phone, so I will be going to a list here, so just to make sure I don't miss anything. The big thing that I have in mind when it comes to N64 Classic is the hardware itself. Now, until this point, normal, sprite-based graphics are pretty easy to process. So, the N64, like the SNES and NES Classic are pretty minor. But when you talk N64, you have to have some kind of 3D graphic processing. And even if it is very simple compared to what's capable today, it's still much beefier hardware than what is currently in these little classic consoles. That also leads to things like memory. So the NES and SNES Classics have about 256 megabytes of internal memory. If they stick to that, you're looking at a very small list of games that are going to be available on this. So I'm thinking like you might only have like maybe 16, because N64 games had much higher memory than these your previous 16 and 8-bit games. So you also have that as a restriction, and if that is too much of a restriction, then you're talking about bigger costs to increase the level of memory. In particular, what I'm thinking of as far as hardware, what I'm thinking of is the controllers themselves. So the N64, if you've never seen it, you need to. The controllers are basically a trident shape. It was a really weird design back in the day, but it held a lot of logic. You had two handles for traditional shoulder buttons and D-pad, and then you had a center handle for a trigger and a thumbstick. And I always thought this was a really cool way of making sure both were accounted for. You know, different games required different ways of handling the controller, and I thought that was really innovative, and it felt like a comfortable controller in my hands. Now, there were things in there that are primitive compared to today. They had buttons instead of a second thumbstick in order to actually differentiate camera angles and things like that. So they saw a need but didn't really solve it in the right way, though that did give other games more face buttons to work with. It got complicated. But it had, like, back in the day, it was pretty innovative controller, not only because it was the first to really feature like a solid rumble feature, but the first to prominently feature a thumbstick, which made three-dimensional games way easier to control. So, pretty revolutionary back in the day, but it's a very large controller compared to your standard NES or SNES brick, and far more complex. You're talking D-pad, start button, 6 face buttons, 2 shoulder buttons, the thumbstick, and a trigger, so you've got control inputs all over the place on the inside. Much more complex hardware, aside from just being larger. And one other thing comes to mind when I'm thinking of the N64 controller, and it's that the thumbstick was crap. If you ever played an N64, your controller wore out in like 6 months. In about 6 months' time, even with casual play, you'd eventually notice that your thumbstick is not as responsive as it used to be. It's, you know, the dead zone in the middle seems a little bit wider, and I have to push the stick a little bit harder in order to actually acknowledge the control I'm trying to do. And that is the result of how it was engineered. It had a lot of plastic rubbing, a lot of friction internally. N64 owners will recall that a lot of thumbsticks had dust that actually formed at the base of their thumbstick, which was the plastic inside wearing off and actually coming out the controller. It was really frustrating back then. You ended up replacing that controller a lot, especially if you had games like Mario 64, and who didn't have Mario 64 if you had this system, where you actually had to rock the control stick, turn around. A lot of games loved to make you rock and rotate the stick, spin it around, you know, trying to get things to spin in the game. A lot of games liked doing that because, hey, it's a cool thing you can do with this new thumbstick thing. It destroyed the controllers. You know, I played it casually for the most part, and mostly one-player stuff. So I went through like 4 or 5 controllers in the time I had my N64, plugged in, and that was just single-player stuff. Like, imagine if this was a party system, or if my friends came over more often, I would have been going through like a dozen controllers over the lifespan of this console. I mean, it would have been ridiculous. So, please, if this happens, the thumbstick needs to be reworked. It needs to be modernized. Look like the original, fine, but it has to function like a modern one that isn't going to self-destruct. That said, that will make it a little bit more expensive than we're planning on here. So, in my head, what I'm coming down to is I feel like this system is not going to have as many games, because we did see the NES Classic with 30, and then the Super Nintendo Classic went down to 21. I'm ballparking maybe 16, depending on how much memory the N64 really wants to pack in. And then I'm thinking, well, geez, it's it went up to $80 to pack in an extra controller for the SNES Classic. So, if we're talking 2 controllers for this one, especially with the size of the controllers, the complexity, and the need to upgrade them, you're maybe looking at $100 for this system potentially. And that wouldn't surprise me in the least, especially because you have to remember the N64 was designed as a party console. It had 4 controller ports built right in. You were supposed to play this with a whole bunch of friends, and you had a lot of games that emphasized 4-player capabilities. So you're going to have to include 2 controllers no matter what. It'll make it expensive, and that might deter people, but 2 controllers means that most of your titles are at least going to be more palatable. And if you want to play full party mode, then you only have to go buy 2 additional controllers instead of 3. You know, you might be able to make it easier to buy with just one, but you're also going to enforce a big purchase later on for people who want, you know, 4-player Smash Brothers or 4-player Mario Kart. You know, things that the system was designed for in the first place. And that does kind of bring me to the game library. And here's the other problem that I cannot really get my head around here, because the N64 notoriously did not have third-party support. And that's because it was notoriously difficult to program for, and a lot of companies were leaning toward the PlayStation at the time with its optical drive and much, much higher memory. You know, N64 launch titles were maybe like 16, maybe 32 megabytes in size, whereas a PlayStation CD had like 700 megabytes. It could, you know, it's, you know, if you were a game developer, which would you go with? The one where you can include like full voice dialogue and fully animated scenes and fully rendered scenes, or the N64? You know, it's where Nintendo lost a lot of its third-party support, and I don't think ever completely regained it. So you don't have a whole lot of third-party games that you can go for, and the ones that you could name might not be possible, thanks to who currently owns them. We'll get to that, but I kind of want to go over a potential list that I've been kind of floating around in my brain space. So I've got a list here, see, just to double check, make sure I've got the right number here, 4, 8. So I kind of want to play this game where we do this kind of fantasy thing, where I'm kind of going, okay, this is kind of what I would imagine the lineup would look like, but we're going to play fair here. We're actually going to stick to what we know of the systems and what we can appropriately guess about the upcoming N64 Classic. Now, for starters, we know Nintendo is going to stick to a T rating. They absolutely do not want an M on this thing that would restrict who could actually buy it. Not that kids would be interested in these kind of retro 3D graphics. I find 8 and 16-bit sprites age far better than 3-dimensional graphics, but you never know. And it's still Nintendo. They're going to be family friendly. They'd hate to put out an M-rated product on this. So we're going to keep it to that. I'm also going to name a list that avoids licensed titles because, one, the best licenses out there are possibly unobtainable, and you really want to stick to the core N64 games as much as possible, not only for mass appeal, but also because it keeps the licensing fee down, which would potentially keep the cost of the system down. If this thing has any hope of launching at $80, it is because it will not be licensing any other games from any other companies. You know, you think about it this way, the SNES Classic at $80 really only licensed from 3 companies, Capcom, Square, and Konami. 3 companies that are notoriously nice with Nintendo over the years, so that's not too hard to work out. You know, and it's very 3 well selected to get variety in that system. So this is the list. This is the list I came up with after, you know, much deliberation. So, of course, you got your classics in your platform department. You have Super Mario 64, you have Donkey Kong 64, which they do have the rights to, even though Rare developed it, Yoshi's Story, and Kirby 64. Of course, both Legend of Zelda, Ocarina of Time, and Majora's Mask, Star Fox 64, and Pilot Wing 64, Super Smash Bros., Paper Mario, Pokemon Snap, because it's the only first-person shooter of any kind that's going to be on a Nintendo system, Mario Kart 64, Wave Race 64, F-Zero X, Diddy Kong Racing, again, Nintendo-owned characters, so we can do that, though Conker will probably have to be edited out, so maybe not, and Mario Tennis. So, you look at these, and you get enough games there, and they're all Nintendo-owned, and they don't have any licensing issues going on here, with maybe the exception of Conker. But you do run into an issue here, and that is variety. You know, part of the thing about the SNES Classic is I love the variety on the system. I mean, you got a bunch of platformers, but they all feel different because you've got shooting platformers, you've got, Mega Man game, Mega Man X, which is a lot of wall jumping and things that you can't exactly do in Mario World. And so you do have variety there. And also with the Square RPGs, all of them do play considerably different from each other. So even though there's 4 RPGs total on the system, you do still have a lot of things you can do. But that still means, but you still have to factor in the fact that it's a much larger game library than what I'm potentially guessing at here. I can be totally off. It could be 20 games just because they increase the memory. But even then, you're going to have a hard time filling these slots with things that aren't platformers or race games, because those were pretty popular on the N64. Just as an example, I left off, Cruisin' USA, 1080 Snowboarding, and Excite Bike 64, which all 3 you could make an argument should be on the system. They are all 3 big sellers, but they're all racing games. And we've already got 4 of them on here. And, and really, Wave Race F-Zero X and Mario Kart 64 are very different from each other. Diddy Kong Racing is a Mario Kart clone. So, I know, maybe not. Maybe that wouldn't be on there. But you see where the problem here comes from. You've got 4 platformers available and 4 race games available. If I'm guessing right, and we're down to 16 games for memory limitations, then that's 2 genres taking up half of the capabilities of this system. And I fully acknowledge this is all speculation, but that's still a huge number to be taken up by just 2 genres without having a huge library behind it. Looking at this again, you only have like 1 sports title, you only have 1 RPG. And this is a big thing for me because the beauty of the SNES Classic is there's a bunch of games that you can pick up and play for half hour, maybe an hour, and just put it down. Street Fighter and F-Zero are very much like that. And then you have Final Fantasy III and Mario RPG and even Mario World that can engross you for hours on end. It's great to have both types of games on there. And there are plenty of platformers like Donkey Kong Country are going to keep you busy for a long, long time on this thing. But as far as just different game options here, only 1 RPG, 1 fighting game with Smash Brothers, and Pokemon Snap adds some variety, tennis adds a little variety, but you're really kind of lacking compared to the other 2 classic consoles. Now, you'll notice a few other omissions here. There are 4-player games, listed in here. You got Mario Kart 64, of course, and Diddy Kong Racing, Mario Tennis, and Smash Brothers, and all this. 1 I left off, which could add variety if you dump like Diddy Kong, is Diddy Kong or F-Zero. Now that I think of it, 1 that you could add for variety's sake is Mario Party, but again, party game only. You really do need 3 or 4 people to really play that game, and it does kind of take away from the library if it's unappealing to play single player. And to be honest, playing a board game by yourself might be one of the lonelier experiences you can imagine. And then another one left off, Pokemon Stadium. One of the biggest sellers on the system, completely unnecessary now because the whole point of Pokemon Stadium was to see Pokemon battling in 3D. Not special anymore, and the single player on that game is extremely thin. I can understand some wanting it for nostalgia's sake, but outside of watching YouTube videos of the announcer and some of the goofier animations, I don't really see where the necessity for this game would be on a classic console, especially because you can't plug a Game Boy game into it anymore. So you have issues there. Overall, you want to talk some other issues here. A bunch of these games are either available digitally on the Wii U, or have already been remade with superior versions, and sometimes they come up pretty cheap. Like I'm sitting, it's right here in reach, as a matter of fact. I just got a refurbished copy of Ocarina of Time 3D, $10. Can't really beat that, now can you? You have Majora's Mask that's far more recent. You've got Star Fox 64 remade on the 3DS. You've got Smash Brothers, which arguably you don't need to go back to the original if you've got any of the more updated ones. I'm sure someone who obsesses over Melee is going to give me guff over that. And looking over some of these others, you do have all these different remakes that, superior versions that came out. This was a really popular system to remake because the graphics don't age that well, but they're still well-remembered titles. So that's another obstacle here. Now, the big games listed, the big games missing from this are all from Rare. Rare is responsible for Diddy Kong Racing and Donkey Kong 64, but those are entirely Nintendo owned, so as long as they, change up a few of the graphics and, as we keep saying, conquer, you could potentially release those on an N64 Classic with no issue. But most of the best remembered titles on the N64 came from Rare, and that is where your problem lies. Now, if we're looking over the list, just the games that we are missing out because of this. So you got Banjo-Kazooie, Banjo-Tooie, GoldenEye 007, Killer Instinct Gold, Jet Force Gemini, Blast Corps, Perfect Dark, and Conker's Bad Fur Day. Now, those last two we do admit would not be on here no matter what because M rating. But the others don't go higher than a T, so fair game if they were available. Now, maybe this is a hard limit. Maybe it's not, because guess what? We do have an actual proof of working relationship between Nintendo and Microsoft, and it is called Minecraft on the 3DS, on the Wii U, on the Switch, because remember, Mojang is completely owned by Microsoft now. Those games exist, which does mean there is an amicable partnership capable between the two competitors, which is kind of an interesting thing when you think about it. But it's in an area where it benefits both parties to have those things, and they're not really in direct competition with each other in any way. Because Minecraft's available on so many platforms, you're really not going to be hurt in any way by putting it on a few of Nintendo's systems. Now, if you could actually get Microsoft on board, because there is no such thing as an Xbox Classic, and there probably will not be such thing as an Xbox Classic where you can go, plug and play the original Halo, for instance. Even with that, you still run into an obstacle, and it's called Rare Replay, which came out just 2 years ago. You can probably still find on the shelves, and was a pretty good commercial success as far as I remember. And that offers up most of the titles I just named. So you're also, that's where there is competition with a potential release on an N64 Classic. If you do manage to get Microsoft to play ball, then the only thing I can think of here is it has to be limited. You have to be limited in what you actually gain from it so that they're not directly competing, and it's more amicable for Microsoft to go ahead and say, sure, you can go ahead and we'll license those games to you. So if you keep it to just like, I hate to add another platformer on here, but Banjo-Kazooie definitely deserves to be on a system like this. And Blast Corps, which is still a really unique game and would really add variety to the system, I think would definitely benefit. Maybe Jet Force Gemini because we're low on action titles, but I don't think they'd be willing to give all of them up. Maybe those. See, beyond this, there's only one license I can imagine that Nintendo could potentially get in order to add variety and add some third-party developers into the N64 Classic without really going too far, without including any duds, or with, and still making sure that some of the A titles are in there. And that is Star Wars. Now, all those games were developed by LucasArts, so all you have to do is get the license from Disney. And I don't know if you've noticed this or not, but a lot of companies license Star Wars. It might not be all that hard to get the license just for the 3 games that were released on the N64 that people remember really, really well. That's Shadows of the Empire, Episode 1 Racer, though I'd hate to add more race games once again, and Rogue Squadron, which was a legitimate Game of the Year candidate. That's the big one. That's the one I think they need to go after. If that's possible, if that's viable, I think you have something there. You know, and that adds a really cool flight sim, that adds a really cool name that you can put on the box. And it adds something besides a Nintendo-developed game. Now, the one that of course, the one everyone wants is going to be GoldenEye 007. If that is on there, if that's on the N64 Classic, instant party machine. You know, you're going to be, Nintendo knows they will not stop being, they will never produce enough controllers for all of the parties that are going to be going on playing that game, because that's ridiculously fun to play with 4 people. I miss playing that game with 4 people. That said, really difficult. You need to get Microsoft on board, and then you need the license for it too. And I did a little bit of digging here. No one currently has the rights to James Bond as a video game license. There's rumor that Telltale might be working on something, but it's mostly speculation right now. There's no confirmation as of this video that they have any kind of James Bond license. I think the last time someone did was like 3 years ago, and that was dropped because it was Activision. And they dropped it because they wanted to work on their own IPs. So that might actually be available, and it wouldn't be the first time that it was rumored that Nintendo and Nintendo was trying to work toward getting 007 back on a console, because they did try it one time. Them and Microsoft could not come to terms back then, but we've seen them work together now. Might be a little bit more viable, and viable because the big thing here is you've got these casual gamers and nostalgic gamers who are going to go up and pick this system up, but if the titles they remember, the titles they had the most fun playing, are not going to be on there, the legendary games, there's going to be disappointment, and there's going to be a resentment toward this system. I think if they can pull all the strings and get 007 on the N64 Classic, it would sell as fast as the NES and SNES. Otherwise, I think you're going to have a hard time, because I do foresee a bigger price. I do foresee a more limited game list, both in number and variety. And I know that there is a market that's going to expect these legendary titles and not really understand why they aren't on there. It's just going to hurt their image that they aren't on there. So that is my expectation. I'm hopeful that maybe some of those rare titles actually do end up on the system. I would love to see it, but I do think that there are certain keys to making it successful and to make it acceptable to to a wider audience. Because of course the Nintendo hardcores are going to be lining up day one. I will probably be lining up day one. That said, it's going to be a tricky sell. I'm looking forward to seeing whatever they come up with, but this is going to be a tricky one. So let me know what you guys think down in the comments. Let me know what games you wish would be on there. I tried to make it a fair list and not put on any personal favorites, because no one but me is going to want Mischief Makers on this thing. I take that back. I did see one list that put Mischief Makers on there. I can't remember what site posted it, but I love you for doing it. But yeah, there's so many favorite titles that could be on here, but they're pet favorites. Let me know what you guys think. If you think the N64 is going to be viable as a classic, if Rare might play ball and we might actually get some of those legendary titles, or which ones you want to see. What are your pet favorites on the N64 that you'd want to play again on a system like this? So just let me know. We might get a little bit of a conversation started. So back to business as usual. I've got more reviews to do, so I will see you guys soon.